You got real money? Or you planning to pay with that jingling pile of change? This is Dolce Vita, not a candy machine. Brad Coleman smirked and slid the glass jar of coins back toward Sophia like it was something filthy. She tightened her grip on the paper bag, holding a small strawberry cake. The one thing she'd saved for a whole month to buy for her daughter's birthday. The little girl waiting at home. It's enough. I counted it. Her voice shook, but it didn't break. Brad didn't bother counting. He flipped his hand, and the whole jar spilled across the polished bakery floor, coins rolling under tables, clinking against chair legs. Pick it up. People like you shouldn't even walk through that door. The whole shop went dead silent. A few phones quietly rose into the air. A 27-year-old single mother knelt down on the floor, gathering each coin, her cheeks burning with shame. But there was a man sitting in the corner who'd watched the whole thing. Worn leather jacket, faded jeans, a cold espresso on the table, eyes calm enough to chill the room. Brad never once glanced his way. He had no idea that the plain-looking man was Lorenzo Bellondi, the boss of the most powerful family in New York, the man who'd signed his name to buy this entire chain of bakeries just 3 days earlier. Brad had no idea that the coins he'd just knocked to the floor would bring down the whole world he'd spent 5 years building. His job, his reputation, and everything he ever thought was his. If this story moves you even a little, drop a like and share it so it reaches the person who needs to hear it most. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our stories about human dignity every week. Now sit back, and let me tell you what happened next. 4 hours before the coins scattered across the floor of Dolce Vita, Lorenzo Bellondi stood silently beside the enormous glass window on the 42nd floor of a tower in Midtown, looking down at all of New York City moving beneath his feet. He didn't look with the eyes of a conqueror. He looked like a man who had just set one more brick onto the road he had spent many years building. The road that would bring the Bellondi name out of the darkness and into the light. On the walnut desk behind him lay a thick file, signed only 3 days earlier. 18 bakeries across all 5 boroughs. A multi-million-dollar deal. To the press, it was the latest investment of a discreet businessman. To those who understood the truth, it was the final step in washing clean a family line that had once lived in the city's dark corners. The door opened. Sal Vitale stepped in, the only trusted man Renzo had kept at his side for 15 years. Graying hair, broad shoulders, footsteps that made no sound. All the paperwork is finished, sir. The marketing team wants to hold a press conference at the Central shop on Friday. They're asking whether you'd like to cut the ribbon. Renzo didn't turn around right away. He looked at the tiny stream of people below, people he understood very well, because he had once been one of them. Cancel the press conference, he said quietly. Sal frowned. Cancel it, sir? I want to go see the shops myself first. No banners, no cameras, no one knowing I'm the owner. He turned back, and Sal saw that familiar look in his eyes, the look that over the years had taught him not to ask questions. Renzo walked to the cabinet in the corner of the room, took off the tailored suit worth an ordinary person's entire month of wages, and hung it carefully on a hanger, as though hanging up a shell. Then, he put on an old, worn leather jacket, the jacket Sal had seen dozens of times but had never understood why one of the richest bosses in the city still kept. A pair of faded jeans, a pair of shoes with worn-down heels. You're planning to go dressed like that? Sal asked, though he already knew the answer. A person being kind to wealthy customers doesn't tell you much, Renzo replied, zipping up the jacket. I want to see how they treat someone who looks like he has nothing. The way a person treats someone who can neither repay them nor retaliate, that is who they really are. Sal was silent for a moment. He knew those words hadn't come from Renzo himself. They were the words of his late mother, the woman who had raised Renzo alone in a cramped apartment in Brooklyn, the woman who had once been humiliated in the very place where she washed dishes for hire, simply because of her old clothes. Renzo had never said much about her, and Sal had never asked. But every time the boss put that leather jacket on, Sal understood that some part of the past was still alive inside this man's chest, even though he now stood at the top of everything. Let me send someone with you, Sal said. Nothing loud, just a precaution. Renzo nodded. You and Marco. Stay outside, wait in the car. Don't let anyone recognize you. I'm only going in for a cup of coffee and a look around. He picked up the keys to the old Buick, instead of the gleaming car parked in the garage below, the kind of car no one would glance at twice on the street. Before going out, he stopped and looked once more at the file on the desk, the Belandi name printed boldly beneath the blue signature. "Which shop first, sir?" Sal asked. Renzo put on a plain baseball cap with no logo and pulled the brim low. "Dolce Vita, the uptown branch. The shop I used to stand outside and stare into through the glass when I was a kid, without a few coins in my pocket." The elevator doors closed behind him. A short later, he would be sitting in the corner of that shop with a cold cup of espresso, silently witnessing something that would make him remember everything he thought he had left behind. That same afternoon, a few subway rides away from Midtown, Sophia Marchetti stepped out of the office building where she had just finished a cleaning shift that had lasted since early morning, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. She was 27 years old, but on some days she felt much older than that. Her dark brown hair, tied back in a hurry, had come loose in several strands that clung to her sweat-damp cheeks. She zipped up her thin coat, the one already worn at the elbows, and quickened her pace along the cold sidewalk. Today wasn't an ordinary day. Today was Bella's birthday. Her 4-year-old daughter was resting at home with Mrs. Rosa, the elderly neighbor who lived on the same floor, the kind woman who always watched Bella whenever Sophia had to work 2 shifts in a row. That morning, the little girl had been running a slight fever, just a small cold according to Mrs. Rosa, but it was still enough to make Sophia's heart tighten every time she thought of it. Before Sophia left, Bella had held onto her hand, her big round eyes looking up, and whispered that all she wished for was a strawberry cake. The pink kind with a red strawberry on top, the kind she had once seen in an old comic book. Sophia had promised. She had promised with everything left in her tired heart. The apartment she rented was on the 5th floor of a building with no elevator, so cramped that Bella's bed and the kitchen corner almost touched each other. But it was clean, because Sophia had never allowed poverty to take away her decency or her self-respect. Her husband had left while she was still pregnant, leaving mother and child behind with bills and an empty promise. Her mother died 2 years after that. Since then, Sophia's world had held only Bella, and every dollar she earned revolved around those big round eyes. Last night, after Bella fell asleep, Sophia had sat at the small table beneath the weak yellow light and taken down an old glass jar she kept on top of the cabinet. Inside the jar were the coins she had saved for an entire month, the spare change left over from grocery trips, the few tips from her evening kitchen shift. Every 5-cent coin, 10-cent coin, and 25-cent coin tucked away as carefully as if she were gathering hope itself. She poured them all onto the tabletop and counted them again and again beneath the light, her calloused fingers moving through the cold metal. $11.50. Just enough, she calculated silently. Just enough to buy the smallest strawberry cake at Dolce Vita, the elegant shop she had never dared step inside, but the only place in the neighborhood still open late and selling the exact pink cake her daughter had dreamed of. She poured all the coins back into the jar, screwed the lid on tightly, then placed it beside her purse, as though setting down a treasure. Now, on her way to the shop, that jar rested in her hand, jingling softly with each hurried step. She stopped on the sidewalk, pulled out her worn phone, and quickly called home to Mrs. Rosa, her voice softening at once when she heard the elderly neighbor say Bella was still fine, sleeping peacefully, and every so often asking whether her mother had bought the cake yet. Sophia let out a small laugh, tired but warm, then promised she would be home very soon with the prettiest cake. She hung up, drew in a deep breath, pulled her collar higher, and walked faster. At the end of the street, the warm yellow lights of Dolce Vita spilled through the large glass window, where the cakes were displayed inside the gleaming case, like something from a dream she had never belonged to. Sophia tightened her grip on the jar. She didn't know that behind that glass door, beyond that space fragrant with butter and vanilla, there was a man already waiting to witness her kindness, and another man waiting to trample it underfoot. The glass door gave a small chime when Sophia pushed it open, and warmth, along with the sweet smell of butter, immediately wrapped around her, so different from the cold outside. She stood tucked to one side, the glass jar held tightly against her chest, her hesitant eyes moving over the gleaming display cases filled with cakes. Behind the counter, a young woman looked up, her face brightening with a sincere smile. Megan Reyes, only in her early 20s, her hair pinned neatly into a bun, her eyes carrying the look of someone whose kindness hadn't yet been hardened by work. "Hello, ma'am. Come on in. How can I help you?" Her voice was as warm as the room itself. Sophia let out a breath of relief and stepped closer to the counter, her shoulders slowly relaxing. "Hello. I'd like to buy a strawberry cake, just a small one, the kind with the red strawberry on top." She spoke with a little hesitation, but hope shone through her voice. Today is my daughter's birthday. She's 4 years old, and she's been dreaming about that cake. Megan smiled, her eyes softening. Oh, that's so sweet. We have exactly that kind. Strawberry cake with fresh cream. Little kids love it. Let me get you the freshest one. The girl turned, about to walk toward the cake case, and in that moment, the air inside the shop truly seemed warm. A poor mother and a kind young woman, a small cake for a child's birthday. But then a figure stepped out from the passage behind the counter, and everything changed. Brad Coleman, the shop manager, tall, blonde hair slicked back with glossy gel, his shirt perfectly pressed, a bright watch on his wrist that he kept turning again and again, as though he were afraid people wouldn't notice it. His eyes swept once from Sophia's loose, messy hair down to the coat, worn thin at the elbows, then stopped on the glass jar full of coins she was holding, and the corner of his mouth curved into a smile with no warmth in it at all. Megan. He called her name in a drawn-out voice, one hand landing on the young woman's shoulder to stop her. Let me handle this customer. Megan froze, her smile slowly fading. I was getting the cake for her, Brad. She just wants. I heard. Brad cut her off, his eyes still fixed on Sophia. He stepped around to the front of the counter, folded his arms across his chest, and stood between her and the cake cases like a gate slamming shut. This is an upscale bakery, not a place just anyone can wander into. Are you sure you found the right place? Sophia blinked and drew back half a step, but she still held her head up. I came to buy a cake. I have money, sir. She spoke softly, but clearly, her fingers tightening around the jar. Brad glanced down at that jar again, his eyes full of contempt, and let out a little snort of laughter. Behind him, Megan stood rooted to the floor, both hands gripping the front of her apron, her young eyes moving back and forth between the manager and the woman standing there with all the fragile dignity she had left. She wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat. There were still a few customers in the shop, a middle-aged couple by the window, an older man reading a newspaper, and all of them began to look up as Brad's voice grew louder. And in the farthest corner of the room, where the light was softest, a man in an old leather jacket sat silently beside an espresso that had gone cold. Lorenzo Bellondi didn't say a word. He only kept his hand around the small cup, his calm eyes following every movement of the manager, every curl of the lip, every contemptuous glance. He had been sitting there long enough to understand what he was witnessing, and he was composed enough not to act too soon. Brad planted one hand on the counter, leaned toward Sophia, his smile tightening on his lips as his gaze once again dropped to the jar full of coins in her hands. Brad took the glass jar from Sophia's hands without even asking, turned it upside down over the granite counter so the coins spilled out with a loud clatter, then began dragging his fingers through them slowly and deliberately, as though he were touching something filthy. Let's see, he said, his voice drawn out with mockery, flicking each coin aside with the tip of his fingernail. 5 cents, 10 cents, another 5 cents. You do know this is Dolce Vita, don't you? Our customers pay with black cards, not by dumping their whole piggy bank onto the counter. He looked up, his mouth curving with contempt, loud enough for the whole shop to hear. If I stand here counting loose change for you, when am I supposed to serve real customers? Sophia stood still, her 2 hands clenched together, her cheeks slowly growing hot. But her voice remained steady. I counted it at home. It's $11.50. I only need the small strawberry cake, sir. Brad stopped moving his hand and looked up at her with the eyes of a man who had already decided that today he wouldn't let this woman have what she wanted. Ah, the small strawberry cake, he repeated, then turned toward the display case and tapped his finger against the glass where the little pink cake with the red strawberry on top was sitting. Too bad. That one has already been reserved. A customer is coming to pick it up this afternoon. It was a blatant lie, and he knew it perfectly well, because there wasn't any reservation card in the display case, and Megan, standing right behind him, knew perfectly well that no one had reserved that cake. If you want strawberry cake, Brad went on, pulling a larger box from the display shelf, then this is the only one left. 3-layer strawberry cake with Italian cream. $28. Premium quality, worthy of a special occasion. He pushed the box toward her with a tight smile, fully aware that the money in the jar couldn't possibly reach that amount. Sophia looked at the box, then looked back at the coins on the counter, and her throat tightened. I don't have enough for that one. I only need a small cake. Any small strawberry cake would be fine. Her voice began to tremble, not from anger, but from the helplessness rising in her chest. Brad shrugged, gathered the coins together with a lazy gesture, then counted them carelessly, deliberately skipping some, deliberately brushing a few aside. And anyway, you counted wrong. This isn't even $10. Don't come in here trying to cheat me out of a few dollars in change. That was another lie, another calculated humiliation, because he had intentionally refused to count all of it, so he could turn her into a dishonest person in front of everyone. By then, Megan couldn't bear it anymore. She stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. Brad, I saw that she has enough, and that small strawberry cake isn't reserved. Megan. Brad snapped around, lowering his voice into something sharp and cold, just loud enough for the young woman to hear. You've only been working here a few months. Do you know I'm the one who signs the shift schedule? Do you know how many girls out there are waiting in line for your job? Say one more word, and I'll write you up before your shift ends. The threat dropped like a block of ice. Megan froze, tears gathering in her eyes, her hand trembling as it clenched the front of her apron. She stepped back half a pace, lowered her head, and her gaze met Sophia's for one brief moment, a look that said everything, that she was sorry, that she wanted so badly to help, but she couldn't, because she too was clinging to this job just to survive. Sophia gave the girl a small nod, one so slight it was almost invisible, as if to say that she understood, that it was all right. And in the corner of the room, the man in the old leather jacket was still sitting there, his fingers now tightened a little more around the cold espresso cup, his eyes never leaving the scene unfolding before him, silently remembering every face, every word, every act of cowardice being laid bare in front of him. Sophia stood there for a long while, her eyes resting on the coins scattered across the stone counter, the money she had saved for an entire month, now being pushed back and forth by a stranger's hand, as if it were garbage. Her throat tightened with bitterness, and for the first time since she had stepped inside, she felt her eyes begin to burn. She didn't cry. She wouldn't allow herself to cry in front of this man, but the feeling of being trampled on, of being turned into a joke in a room full of strangers, was heavier than any work shift she had ever carried. She thought of Bella waiting at home, of those big round eyes and the promise of the little pink cake. Maybe she should leave. Maybe she should gather up her coins, walk out that door, find some grocery store still open, and buy her daughter a cookie. Something. Anything. As long as she didn't have to stand here for one more second being humiliated. With trembling hands, she began sweeping the coins together, intending to put them back into the jar. All right, she said quietly, her voice breaking at the end. I'll go somewhere else. I'm sorry to have bothered you. She turned toward the door, her shoulders slumped, the jar held against her chest. After a few steps, she stopped beside the glass window, pulled out her phone once again, her hand still shaking. She dialed Mrs. Rosa's number, pressed the phone to her ear, and when the elderly neighbor's voice came through, Sophia's voice suddenly softened, gentle as if the harsh world outside had never touched it. Mrs. Rosa, it's me. Is Bella asleep yet? On the other end, Mrs. Rosa said the little girl was still awake, hugging her old teddy bear and waiting for her mother, every now and then asking whether Mommy had bought the strawberry cake yet, and saying she wanted to save the first candle to blow out with her. Sophia closed her eyes and rested her forehead against the cold glass. She could even hear Bella's voice calling faintly from far away. Mommy, come home soon. In that moment, something inside her chest tightened, then flared to life. She had promised her child. She had promised, and a mother didn't give up just because someone like Brad had made her feel ashamed. Her little girl deserved the cake from her dream, and Sophia wouldn't walk out of this door empty-handed. I'll be home soon, Mrs. Rosa. I'll bring the cake back for her. Please tell Bella to wait just a little longer for Mommy. She hung up, drew in a deep breath, quickly wiped the corner of her eye with the back of her hand, then turned and walked back to the counter. This time, her posture was straighter, and her eyes no longer looked away. She set the jar on the counter and looked directly at Brad. Sir, I'm asking you, just one small strawberry cake. Anyone in the case will do. Today is my daughter's birthday. She's only 4 years old, and this is all she wished for. I have enough money. I counted it very carefully. Please don't do this. Her voice no longer trembled. It was firm, soaked in the kind of dignity poverty couldn't take away. The whole shop went utterly silent. The couple by the window stopped chewing. The man reading the newspaper lowered the page, Megan stood behind the counter, both hands covering her mouth. But that sincere plea, instead of softening Brad, seemed to touch the very center of his arrogance. His face hardened, the smile disappeared, and in its place came the irritation of a man who couldn't bear being pleaded with, couldn't bear seeing someone he considered beneath him dare to stand upright in front of him. He glanced at the coins on the counter, then at Sophia's determined face, and something cold flashed in his eyes. Slowly, he reached his hand toward the glass jar, his fingers spreading open. From the farthest corner of the room, Lorenzo Belandi heard the sound before he even had time to look up. The sharp ringing of metal striking tile, then scattering through the shop as coins rolled in every direction, a few reaching the foot of the table where he sat, spinning in place before falling still. In that moment, the whole room seemed to hold its breath, and he saw the woman kneeling in the middle of the floor, her loosened brown hair falling over her bowed face, her shoulders trembling as she silently gathered each coin. Something very old, very deep inside Renzo's chest, suddenly woke. The image of another woman, in another place, many years before, who had once bent down just like that, beneath the contemptuous eyes of people who believed poverty meant a person deserved to be trampled. He set the cold espresso cup down on the table gently, without making a sound, then stood. He didn't hurry. He walked past the tables with an unhurried but certain stride, and the whole shop seemed to feel that something was changing, though no one yet understood what it was. The man reading the newspaper lifted his head fully. The couple by the window turned to look. Brad, still standing behind the counter with the hand he had just lowered, frowned when he saw the man in the old leather jacket approaching. Renzo didn't look at him. He walked straight to Sophia, bent one knee to the floor beside her, and in a deep voice so warm it made her freeze midway through her movement, he said softly, "Stand up. A mother like you should never have to kneel for something like this." Sophia looked up, her eyes red, staring in confusion at the stranger holding out his hand to her. She hesitated for a moment, then placed her trembling hand in his palm, and Renzo gently helped her to her feet. Then, before the stunned eyes of the entire room, he was the one who bent down. He picked up the coins one by one, patiently, carefully. The 5-cent coin that had rolled beneath a table, the 10-cent coin lying beside a chair leg, the 25-cent coin stopped in a strip of afternoon sunlight spilling through the window. He gathered them into his palm as though gathering precious things, with no hint that this was a performance, simply a man picking up the dignity someone else had just thrown to the floor. When he had picked up the last coin, he stood, walked to the counter, placed all the coins back into the glass jar, screwed the lid on, then set it in Sophia's hands. Only then did he turn to look at Brad, and for the first time all afternoon, his calm eyes met the manager's face directly. "Do you know what you just did?" he asked, his voice never rising, still even, cold as the surface of a frozen lake in the middle of winter. Brad snorted, folded his arms, and tried to keep his arrogant look, though something in the other man's eyes made him uneasy. "I'm running my shop, and who are you to interfere? You came in here for one cheap cup of coffee and now you're going to lecture me?" Renzo didn't answer right away. He looked at the man for a long while, the look of someone who had seen far too many men like him in his life, then said, slowly, one word at a time, "You didn't humiliate a poor woman. You humiliated someone you believed couldn't do anything to you. You thought she had no power, no voice, no one standing behind her, so you felt free to trample her. That wasn't one reckless moment. That is who you truly are, and today, it just stepped into the light." Those words hung suspended in the utterly silent room, and Brad opened his mouth to answer, but somehow no words came out. Megan stood behind the counter staring at the man in the old leather jacket, her heart pounding, a vague instinct telling her that this man was not ordinary at all, no matter how he looked. And Sophia held the jar tightly in her hands, looking up at him, feeling, for the first time all afternoon, that she was being seen as a human being. Brad forced out a scoffing laugh, but it sounded dry and strained in a room so silent that even the low hum of the display refrigerator could be heard. "Who I really am," he repeated, trying to reclaim his arrogance. "What do you know about me? Who do you think you are, standing here preaching morals to me, some drifter in a torn leather jacket? Get out of my shop before I call security." Renzo didn't answer him with words. He only turned his head toward the large glass window facing the street and gave a slight nod, a very small nod, almost too small for anyone to notice, a quiet gesture an outsider might have thought he was making to himself. But outside, beside the old Buick parked close to the curb, two figures who had been waiting all along suddenly straightened. The glass door swung open. The little bell chimed again, but this time it carried no warmth. Sal Vitali stepped in first, a solid figure in a deep black suit, followed by Marco, both of them moving without making a sound, their eyes sweeping once across the shop, with the calm of men who were used to controlling every room they entered. They didn't speak loudly, didn't make a single threatening move, but their presence alone made the air inside the shop grow thick. Brad froze, the smile dying on his lips. The couple by the window sat still as statues. The man with the newspaper folded the page and watched in silence. Sal approached the counter, without looking at Brad even once, took a thick, cream-colored business card from the inside pocket of his jacket, placed it gently on the stone counter, right in front of the manager, then stepped back and stood still with both hands clasped in front of him. Brad looked down at the card, at first with irritation, then his eyes touched the raised lettering, and his entire body went rigid. There were only a few simple lines on the card, the name Belandi Holdings, and beneath it, printed with formal weight, the name Lorenzo Belandi, owner. He read it again and again, his lips moving without sound, the blood slowly draining from his face. He looked up at the man in the old leather jacket, the man he had treated like trash all afternoon, the man he had just tried to throw out like some street wanderer, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like when the ground collapsed beneath his feet. At that exact moment, Sal spoke, his voice deep and steady, just loud enough for the whole shop to hear. "Is everything all right, Mr. Belandi?" That name fell into the room like a hammer striking a thin sheet of ice. Belandi. Who in this city hadn't heard that name? The family once mentioned only in stories people dared to whisper, now standing in the middle of the bakery, in the form of the most ordinary-looking man. Megan raised a hand to cover her mouth, her eyes wide. The couple by the window exchanged a frightened glance. And Brad, the arrogant manager who had always believed that 5 years of seniority made him untouchable, now stood there with both hands trembling, the business card still lying on the counter like a sentence handed down. Mr. Belandi, he stammered, his voice breaking apart. I didn't know. I had no idea it was you. If I had known you were the owner, I would have." "You would have done what?" Renzo cut in, his voice still not rising, yet it stopped Brad in the middle of his sentence. "You would have smiled, given her the cake, called her a valued customer. That is exactly the problem. You aren't kind because you are a kind man. You are kind only when you know the person standing in front of you has power, and with people you believe are beneath you, you give yourself permission to trample them." The whole shop sank into absolute silence, with only the refrigerator humming and the sound of pounding hearts in the chests of the people standing there. Brad opened his mouth, then closed it again, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of what he had just realized, as the whole world he had built for himself began to crack open under his feet. Brad stood rooted behind the counter, both hands gripping the edge of the granite, as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing. He licked his lips, trying to salvage the last bit of calm he had left, then hurried around to the front of the counter, his voice shifting into the flattering tone that only a few minutes earlier he had reserved for customers wearing expensive watches. "Mr. Belandi, please hear me out. This is just a misunderstanding, sir. I didn't mean to do anything to her. It was just a busy afternoon. I was under pressure. I spoke a little too harshly. You know how it is. Running a shop like this is stressful. Sometimes I..." "Don't." Renzo said only one word, but it was enough to choke Brad into silence. He took one step toward him, his eyes still calm in a terrifying way, without a trace of anger, and it was that very calm that sent a chill through the room. "I sat in that corner for nearly an hour. I saw everything. I saw you look her up and down the moment she walked in. I saw you stop your own employee so you could humiliate her yourself. I heard you lie about the cake being reserved. I saw you deliberately undercount her money to make her look like a thief. That wasn't one moment of temper, Brad. That was a chain of choices, one after another, calculated by you to crush a woman simply because you believed she couldn't fight back." Brad opened his mouth, but Renzo raised one hand, and he fell silent at once. A misunderstanding is when you miscount someone's change and then apologize. What you did today has another name. It showed me what kind of man you are when you think no one can make you pay for it. Brad lowered his head, his shoulders trembling, and when he looked up this time, his eyes were red, but Renzo knew perfectly well those weren't tears of remorse. Mr. Belandi, I'm begging you. I've been with this place for 5 years. I have bills to pay. I have my own life. If you give me one chance, I swear I'll. You're not sorry for what you did, Renzo cut in, his voice dropping lower. You're only sorry that I was the one who witnessed it. If I hadn't been sitting in that corner this afternoon, then tomorrow, next week, another mother, another old man, another person who looked as though they had nothing would walk through this door, and you'd do the exact same thing again. That is what I can't allow to happen in any place that carries my name. He turned to Sal and gave a nod. Sal stepped forward, placed a sheet of paper on the counter, and spoke in an even, professional voice. Mr. Coleman, you're suspended effective immediately, pending a full internal investigation. Please surrender your keys, access card, and manager card before leaving. Brad looked at the paper, then looked around the room as if searching for someone who would stand up for him. But the couple by the window only lowered their faces. The man with the newspaper looked away, and Megan, the young woman he had just threatened to fire, stood silently behind the counter without saying a word. His trembling hands reached into his pocket, pulled out the shop keys, and set them on the counter with a metallic jingle that sounded painfully sharp in the silence. Then came the manager card. He unclipped it from his belt and stared for a long moment at the name Brad Coleman printed on it, the name that by tomorrow would mean nothing anymore, before placing it beside the keys. Just then, Tom, the shop's security guard, a large man who had been standing near the door and silently watching the whole thing unfold, stepped closer. Renzo looked at him, then toward the door. Please escort Mr. Coleman outside. Tom gave a small nod, extended one hand toward the exit, his voice deep and without triumph. Let's go, Brad. The manager looked one last time at the keys and the card, then dragged his feet toward the glass door, his shoulders collapsing beneath the weight of everything he had just lost in less than an hour. When the glass door closed behind Brad, the whole room seemed to let out a breath that everyone had been holding. Renzo stood still for a moment, then turned to Sophia, and all the coldness from a few minutes earlier vanished from his face, giving way to a tenderness that made her almost unable to believe this was the same man who had brought that arrogant manager down with only a few words. Are you all right? He asked softly. Sophia was still clutching the glass jar tightly against her chest, her eyes still bright with tears, and she only gave a small nod, not yet able to speak. What's your name? Sophia, sir, she answered in a small voice. Sophia Marchetti. Renzo smiled, a real smile, warm and human. And your daughter? Today is her birthday, isn't it? How old is she? Sophia's eyes stung again when she heard someone ask about her child with such kindness. Bella, sir. She turns 4 today. She only wished for a strawberry cake. Renzo nodded, then walked toward the display case, where the cakes were arranged like pieces of jewelry. He bent slightly to look for a moment, then pointed to the most beautiful cake in the case, the one covered in pure white fresh cream, circled with ripe red strawberries, and finished in the center with a flower made of pale pink frosting. This one, he said to Megan, who had hurried over. Wrap it carefully for me. This is a birthday cake. It has to be perfect. Megan lit up, her hands moving quickly as she lifted the cake out, placed it into a spotless white box, and tied a red ribbon over the top. Sophia looked at the cake, then at Renzo, quickly opening the lid of the jar. Let me pay. I have enough. No, Renzo said, gently placing his hand over the lid of the jar to stop her. Today, you don't have to pay anything. Let this cake be a birthday gift from a stranger to Bella, and you keep every coin in here, because you worked hard for it, and no one has the right to make you feel it's small. Sophia stood motionless, and one last tear finally rolled down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from shame. It came from something she hadn't felt in a very long time, the feeling of being treated like a person with worth. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered. You don't need to thank me, Renzo replied. You only need to go home, hold your daughter, and light that candle. Then he turned to Megan, whose eyes were still red after everything that had happened. And you, he said, his voice softening even more. When everyone in this room chose silence, you spoke up. You knew you could lose your job, and still you told the truth. I want you to remember that moment in yourself, because that kind of character isn't something everyone has. Megan choked up and could only nod, her hands clasped tightly together. Sophia accepted the cake box from the young woman, holding it carefully against her heart as though it were a treasure. then bowed her head to the man who had given back to her the most precious thing of that afternoon. As she stepped toward the door, the late afternoon sunlight spilled through the glass and covered her figure in a warm golden glow. She stopped at the threshold, turned back to look at the man in the old leather jacket still standing there, and in the look they exchanged, there was something that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Then she pushed the door open and stepped outside, the little bell chiming again, this time sounding strangely clear, and she hurried home, toward the place where a 4-year-old child was holding a teddy bear and waiting for her mother with a candle still unlit, carrying not only a cake, but the dignity that had just been returned to her whole. What neither Renzo nor Sophia knew that afternoon was that one of the customers sitting in the bakery, a young woman at a table near the window, had quietly raised her phone and recorded the entire scene, from the moment Brad began raising his voice to the moment he was escorted out the door. The video was less than 4 minutes long, with no editing, no commentary, only the raw image of a mother being humiliated and a man quietly standing up to protect her. That evening, the young woman posted it on social media with a few brief lines, saying this was what she had just witnessed with her own eyes at a bakery in New York. By midnight, the clip had reached a few 100,000 views. By the next morning, that number had passed 3 million, and it still hadn't stopped. Comments poured in like a flood, first with outrage, hot and immediate. People were furious at the way the manager had turned a poor mother's jar of coins upside down, at the contemptuous smile on his face when he lied about the cake, at the cold words he threw out in the middle of the shop. People cut the worst moments into short clips, spreading them even faster than the original, and each clip stirred up a new wave of anger. Then someone gave it a name, a short line that began moving across every platform, the hashtag #PickItUpNYC, and within a few days, it was no longer just a video, but a movement. Beneath that hashtag, thousands of people began telling their own stories, the times they had been looked down on because of old clothes, because of the way they paid, because of how they looked. One woman told the story of being chased out of a store because the staff thought she couldn't afford to buy anything. A student told of being followed through an entire supermarket just because his backpack was worn and frayed. A former delivery worker wrote about the times he had been shouted at near back doors. Every story was different, but all of them carried the same pain. The pain of being treated as if they were worth less, simply because they had less money. As for Brad Coleman, his face was now everywhere. People recognized him on the street, in posts, in clips, shared again and again. His name clung to the video like a scar that couldn't be washed away. And within 2 days, he had deleted every one of his social media accounts. But that no longer meant anything, because the internet had already saved everything. While the public storm grew larger and larger, at corporate headquarters, Sal Vitale placed a tablet on the desk in front of Renzo, the screen showing the video sitting at the top of every ranking. "The whole city is talking about this, sir," Sal said. "And they know you're the man in the video. The communications team is asking whether we should release a statement." Renzo looked at the screen for a while, his face revealing no emotion. He understood better than anyone the weight of attention, and for many years, his family had lived by the rule of staying away from the light. But now everything was different. He was building a new name, a respectable name, a public name, a name recognized by the law, and a man standing up to protect a poor mother in broad daylight was exactly the face he needed the world to see. This wasn't the kind of light he had to avoid. This was the kind of light he could step into. "No rushed statement," he said at last, pushing the tablet back toward Sal. "But I want you to find something out for me. A man like Brad couldn't have acted however he wanted for 5 years without anyone knowing. Someone had to be closing their eyes to him. I want to know what was really happening in that shop before I ever set foot in it." Sal nodded, folded the tablet closed, and in Renzo's eyes then, a new determination began to glimmer, because this story was far from over. Among the millions of people who watched that video, there was one person who didn't stop at outrage. Janet Cho, an investigative reporter in her 30s for a local newspaper, a woman known for articles that had made many powerful people lose sleep, watched the clip again and again. But what caught her attention wasn't the moment the manager collapsed. It was a question that kept circling in her mind. How could someone like Brad Coleman have kept a managerial position for 5 years without ever being called out? A man who behaved like that in broad daylight, in front of a whole bakery full of customers, surely hadn't done it for the first time. And Janet began to dig. She didn't go looking through comments online, but went straight into the inner layer, where the truth was often buried beneath beautiful numbers. She traced Dolce Vita's internal evaluation system, a service quality scorecard that each shop had to report regularly. On paper, Brad's shop had always scored almost perfectly. 5 stars every month, customers satisfied, not one significant complaint. But something didn't fit. Janet began cross-checking, and the gaps slowly showed themselves. She found traces of complaints that customers had once submitted, by phone, by email, through public review sites, and yet not a single one of those complaints appeared in the internal reports. They had been deleted, rewritten, transformed into false positive reviews. An elderly woman who had once complained about the manager's attitude suddenly became, in the records, a satisfied repeat customer. A sharp complaint about being refused service was replaced with a vague note, then marked resolved, even though no one had ever contacted the customer again. These weren't a few scattered mistakes, but an entire system of fabrication that had run smoothly for years, and Brad was the one holding the pen that rewrote those numbers. But the thing that sent a chill down Janet's spine wasn't on paper. It was in the people. She began reaching out to former employees of the shop, people who had quit over the past several years, and a bleak picture slowly emerged. At first, they were hesitant, guarded, but once one person dared to speak, the others began opening up too, as if that video had loosened a knot they had been holding inside for far too long. One young woman who had worked as a cashier said Brad had pressured her so heavily that she finally quit, only because she had dared to defend an elderly customer. A barista said anyone who objected to the way he treated customers had their hours cut, was assigned to the worst shifts, until they eventually resigned on their own. They spoke of an atmosphere where fear was the glue that kept everyone silent, where telling the truth meant losing a livelihood. "We all saw how he treated people," one former employee told Janet, her voice still shaking slightly even though she had left that place long ago. "But everyone had bills to pay, mouths to feed. Speaking up meant losing your job, so we kept our heads down and hated ourselves for it." Janet recorded everything, every name, every story, every piece of evidence, and when she put them together, she realized that the mother in that video wasn't the first victim, but only the first one someone had stood up for, the first one whose ordeal had happened to be recorded in front of the right person. Behind that afternoon's story was an entire culture of fear that had existed quietly for far too long. Janet closed her notebook, looked out the newsroom window, and knew that the article she was about to publish wouldn't just expose one man, but would pull on a long thread. And at the other end of that thread, there had to be others who had looked away and allowed this to continue for all those years. The thread Janet had sensed was indeed real, and the other end of it led her to a name: Raymond Doyle, the regional accountant for the Dolce Vita chain, a 55-year-old man whose job was to review and approve the reports submitted by each shop. In theory, Doyle was the person who should have discovered the fabricated numbers. You should have asked questions when one shop earned perfect scores month after month, while complaints were still quietly floating somewhere beneath the surface. But for years, he had approved everything without once raising a question, placing his signature on false scorecards as though they were perfectly clean. Janet didn't believe it was carelessness, and when she dug deeper into the relationship between the two men, the truth slowly began to show itself. It turned out that Brad and Doyle had known each other before, years before both of them worked for Dolce Vita, and during Doyle's difficult period, Brad was the one who had lent him a considerable sum of money. That debt had never been fully repaid, and it became the invisible chain Brad held in his hand, a form of leverage that forced the accountant to close his eyes and look away. Every time a complaint was in danger of climbing to a higher level, every time a number needed to be made prettier, Doyle quietly approved it, quietly let it pass, because he understood that his financial fate was in the hands of that manager. It wasn't friendship, but control. One side needing to be protected, the other needing mercy for an unpaid debt, and together they built the wall of silence that had shielded Brad for all those years. When Janet published her investigation, along with evidence of falsified reports and the murky financial connection between the two men, public anger surged once again, but this time the fury was no longer aimed at one individual. It was aimed at an entire system that had tolerated wrongdoing. People realized that the story of the poor mother and the jar of coins was only the visible tip of an iceberg buried far deeper below. At corporate headquarters, Renzo read the article from beginning to end, his face still and grave. He called Sal in, placed the newspaper on the desk, and said only one sentence. "I told you to find out, and now we know. It's time to clean this out at the root." The internal investigation was expanded immediately. Raymond Doyle was suspended pending review, and after a short time, once all the evidence was clear, he was fired, his name tied to the scandal the whole city was watching. But Renzo didn't stop at purging the people who had done wrong. He understood that if he removed only a few individuals, without changing the machinery that had produced them, then more Brads, more Doyles would grow in their place. He decided to do something his family in the past had never done: step into the light and speak publicly. A brief statement was released under his name, with no avoidance, no evasions. He admitted that what had happened at the Dolce Vita shop wasn't an isolated incident, but the consequence of a system that had allowed mistreatment to be hidden, allowed cries for help to be erased, and allowed responsibility to be avoided. He declared that the system ended today. The statement spread quickly, and for the first time, people looked at the Bellondi name not with the unease of the past, but with curiosity mixed with respect, for a wealthy and powerful man who had chosen to stand on the side of the most vulnerable. Janet, sitting in the newsroom as she read that statement, smiled faintly, because she knew her article hadn't fallen into silence, but had reached the exact person with enough power and will to turn it into real change. The statement wasn't the ending, but the beginning of what Renzo set out to do immediately afterward. He didn't want his changes to exist only on paper, the way those false scorecards had once sat on Raymond Doyle's desk. They had to reach into every corner of every bakery carrying the Bellondi name. One morning, he personally went to the central branch, not in the old leather jacket this time, but in his true role as owner, standing among the gathered employees and speaking to them in his familiar, calm voice. He didn't read a long speech. He only told them what he had witnessed that afternoon, about a mother kneeling down to pick up every coin, then said that from now on, no one would ever walk through the door of any shop of his and suffer anything like that again. To turn words into action, he had a small plaque installed inside every shop, where everyone could see it, engraved with a simple line saying that every customer who stepped inside deserved respect, and beneath it was a phone number. But what made that line different was that it didn't connect to the shop manager, nor to the regional accountant, the very people the recent story had shown could be bought or controlled, but directly to an independent oversight department Renzo had created himself, where every complaint would be recorded and couldn't be quietly erased by anyone. He also created a channel for employees themselves to speak up without fear of retaliation, because he understood that the fear of losing a job was exactly what had kept that culture of silence alive for far too long. But the deepest change, and the most private one, carried a name the entire chain would later remember. Renzo established a support fund, and when Sal asked what he wanted to call it, he was silent for a moment, then said, "Call it the Bella Fund." Sal was a little surprised, but he didn't ask further. The fund was created to help single mothers and low-income employees, people whose lives could collapse at the edge of one unexpected bill, one month with too few shifts, one hardship they couldn't see coming. It wasn't a showy act of charity meant for photographs and newspapers, but a real hand extended to people who were struggling to stay afloat, just like the mother he had met on that fateful afternoon. And then, more quietly than everything else, without a single public statement, without one mention anywhere, Renzo did something only Sal knew about. He had someone look into Sophia and Bella's situation, and arranged for the little girl's education and care to be properly covered in the years ahead, so the child who had once wished only for a strawberry cake would have the chance to grow up without ever again seeing her mother kneel because she was short a few coins. He didn't want Sophia to know it was him, and he didn't want her to feel she owed anyone. When Sal mentioned that perhaps she deserved to know who was behind it all, Renzo only shook his head. "Kindness that needs credit stops being kindness," he said softly, his gaze turned toward the city outside the window. "I just want that little girl to have a chance. That's enough." In the office high above the city, the man who had once grown up in a cramped apartment in Brooklyn, the man who had once stood outside a bakery window without even a few coins in his pocket, quietly looked out over the city stretching beneath him. He had used his power and wealth to do what no one had done for his mother long ago, and in that moment, something very old inside his chest was finally soothed. The story of a jar of coins spilled across the floor didn't end with the punishment of one man. It became the beginning of something larger, a change that would touch countless lives he would never even meet. Returning to the evening of that fateful day, when Sophia stepped across the threshold of the small apartment on the 5th floor, with the cake box held tightly in her hands, the first thing she heard was the sound of little feet running out, and the clear voice of a little girl calling, "Mommy." Bella, healthy and eager after a long sleep, her cheeks rosy again, threw herself into her mother's arms with shining eyes. "Mrs." Rosa stood beside them with a gentle smile, already having set a small plate on the table. Sophia knelt down to her daughter's height, opened the box, and when the lid was lifted, Bella's eyes grew wide and round at the sight of the strawberry cake covered in pure white cream, with ripe red strawberries arranged in a circle, and a pale pink frosting flower in the center, exactly like the cake from the little girl's dream. They placed 4 small candles on it, and in the flickering candlelight, Bella puckered her lips and blew with all her strength, laughing in delight as the flames went out. Sophia gathered her daughter into her arms, and this time her tears rolled freely, but they were tears of happiness, of gratitude, of a mother who had kept her promise to her child in spite of everything. She looked at the glass jar sitting on top of the cabinet, the jar that had witnessed both humiliation and unexpected kindness in the same afternoon, and she knew she would never forget the stranger who had taught her that a person's dignity was never measured by the amount of money in their pocket. A few days later, Sophia received a message inviting her to come for a meeting at the very Dolce Vita shop where everything had begun. She arrived with a trace of worry, not knowing what they could possibly need from her, and was surprised to see the man in the old leather jacket from that day already waiting for her, this time dressed in something more polished, though his eyes still carried that familiar calm. Renzo invited her to sit, poured her a cup of tea, and went straight to what he wanted to say. "I want to offer you a position here, Sophia. Not as a cashier, but as a shift supervisor. You'll be the person who watches over how the staff treats customers, the person who makes sure no one walks through this door and suffers what you once suffered." Sophia froze, both hands tightening around the teacup. "Mr. Belandi, I'm very grateful, but I don't have management experience. I'm only a cleaning woman and a kitchen helper. I don't want you to give me this job just because you feel sorry for me." Renzo shook his head, and there was a certainty in his voice that made her lift her eyes to him. "This isn't pity, and I never give anyone a position simply because I feel sorry for them. Listen to me. That afternoon, I sat in the corner and watched very carefully. Not only you. I saw the way you spoke to the young cashier, with grace and understanding, even while you yourself were being cornered. I saw you nod to her so she wouldn't blame herself, even though you were the one who needed comfort in that moment. You were humiliated, trampled on, and yet not once did you speak cruelly. Not once did you lose your dignity." He paused and looked straight into her eyes. It's easy for people to be kind when they have everything in their hands. But the way a person behaves when they have almost nothing left, when they've been pushed to the very edge, that is what shows who they truly are. And you, Sophia, are the kind of person I want in this place. I can teach anyone how to run a cash register, but I can't teach kindness and integrity. Those are things you already have." Sophia sat in silence, her eyes stinging again, but this time because of something she had gone too long without daring to believe, that someone could see her true worth, not through her clothes or her jar of coins, but through who she was. She thought of Bella, of the nights she had stayed awake worrying about bills, of working 2 shifts in a row and still not having enough to live on, and a stable job with decent pay felt like a door she had never dared dream of. I'm afraid I'll disappoint you," she said softly. "You won't disappoint me," Renzo replied, and for the first time in their conversation, a faint smile passed across his face. Then his voice lowered, carrying something almost like a confession. "You know, I spent my whole life building power, and for most of that life, I'm not proud of how I built it. There are roads I once walked that I never want my children, or anyone else, to have to step onto. Now I'm trying to do things over, trying to use what I have to build something better, something cleaner, and places like this bakery, people like you. That is how I make amends for the years behind me. You don't owe me anything. If anyone owes anything, it's me trying to repay a debt to my own past." Sophia looked at him for a long while, and in that man's eyes, she no longer saw a frightening, powerful boss, but a human being, sincerely trying to turn toward something good. She drew in a deep breath, set the teacup down, and nodded. "Yes, I accept, and I promise I won't let anyone have to kneel in this shop ever again." Renzo nodded, and in that moment, both of them understood that this wasn't the ending of a sad story, but the beginning of something entirely new. 6 weeks passed, and on a late afternoon, very much like that fateful 1 week before, a man in a worn old leather jacket pushed open the door and stepped into Dolce Vita again. With the same baseball cap pulled low and the same shoes worn down at the heels, Lorenzo Belandi once more wrapped himself in the appearance of a man who had nothing. But this time, everything inside the bakery had changed. The moment the little bell above the door rang, a young employee at the counter looked up with a genuine smile, greeted him, and invited him to take his time choosing a seat. There wasn't a single probing glance, not a single contemptuous frown, only the warmth the bakery should have always had. He stood still for a moment at the threshold, quietly observing, and what he saw made the corner of his mouth lift slightly. The atmosphere inside the shop was far lighter, and the employees moved about with an ease that no longer carried the tense caution of days crushed beneath fear. And standing behind the counter, in a neat uniform with a name tag clearly showing her title as shift supervisor, was Sofia Marchetti. She was guiding a new employee on how to arrange the pastry case, her voice calm and confident, laughing now and then when the young girl asked an innocent question. Sofia's brown hair was now tied back neatly, her shoulders no longer slumped from exhaustion, and in her eyes there was a kind of light that had once been extinguished that afternoon, but had now returned, brighter than ever. Renzo didn't walk over close enough for her to recognize him. He simply sat down at a table in the corner, ordered an espresso, and quietly looked at the fruit of what kindness had planted. In another part of the shop, he recognized Tom, the security guard from that day. He was still working there, and that was something Renzo had considered carefully. He could have dismissed him, because Tom too had stood there in silence that afternoon. But Renzo remembered the moment this guard had hesitated, had not joined in the humiliation even under pressure, and he believed that some people only needed one chance to live according to the better part of themselves. Renzo had met with Tom privately, without scolding him, and had simply told him one thing, that standing by and doing nothing in the face of wrong was also a choice, and that from now on, in this place, he had both the right and the responsibility to speak up. Tom had listened, and now he stood by the door with a different bearing, not like a man standing guard to drive people away, but like someone ready to shield anyone who entered and needed protection. But the thing that held Renzo's gaze the longest was a small object placed right on the counter beside the register. An old glass jar, the very same jar Sofia had once clutched tightly in her hands that afternoon. Now it no longer held coins gathered in humiliation, but had become a tip jar, gleaming inside with loose change that customers gladly dropped in for the kind employees who had served them. She hadn't thrown the jar away, nor hidden it as a painful memory, but had turned it into a symbol, a quiet reminder that from the very place where one human being had once been trampled, kindness had grown and come into bloom. Renzo took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, and quietly left before anyone had time to notice him. As he stepped outside, he paused by the door and looked at the small plaque mounted on the wall, the words about the dignity of every customer now shining beneath the lights. He gave a faint nod to himself, then disappeared into the flow of people on the street, an ordinary man in an old leather jacket, carrying inside himself the peace of someone who had done exactly what needed to be done. In the end, this story isn't only about a jar of coins or a birthday cake. It is about how we treat the people we think can do nothing for us, because it is in those moments that who we truly are is revealed most clearly. It reminds us that dignity is something no one has the right to take away from another person, whether they are rich or poor, respected or looked down upon. And more than anything, it asks each of us one question, that if you had been sitting in that bakery that day, witnessing a mother being humiliated in front of a crowd, would you have been the one who silently looked away? Or would you have been the one brave enough to stand up and speak? The courage to defend someone vulnerable sometimes takes only one sentence, but that sentence can change an entire life. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment sharing the deepest feelings in your heart, because we always hope to hear what you think. How do you feel about the way Sofia held on to her dignity, and about the man who chose to stand up in the middle of a silent crowd? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, and share this video, so together we can spread more meaningful stories about kindness and human dignity to more people every day. Thank you for listening to the story until the very last moment. May you, the person watching this video, always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and calm in every passing day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next stories.